On a calm March morning in 1944, a Dutch merchant ship's crew abandoned their sinking vessel in the Indian Ocean, relieved to have survived a torpedo attack. A Japanese submarine surfaced nearby, and the survivors hoped they would be taken prisoner. Instead, they became victims of one of the most horrific atrocities of World War II. The perpetrator was the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-8, a vessel that gained infamy for brutally massacring shipwreck survivors. Explore the design and service of I-8, its infamous war crimes against SS Tjisalak and SS Jean Nicolet, and the aftermath and chilling legacy of this notorious submarine. I-8 was a Johnson Type J-3 submarine. Along with her sister ship I-7, she was among the largest Japanese submarines completed before the Pacific War. Measuring about 109 meters in length and displacing over 2,500 tons surfaced, I-8 could carry a crew of roughly 100 men. Uniquely, she was built with a watertight hangar and catapult to launch a small floatplane for reconnaissance. This capability allowed I-8 to scout targets far beyond the horizon, a feature intended to give Japan long-range reach across the oceans. Powered by twin diesel engines on the surface and electric motors when submerged, I-8 was both fast and far-ranging. She could make about 23 knots on the surface and had an extraordinary range of 14,000 nautical miles at cruising speed. Her armament reflected a dual role. For surface combat, she mounted a twin 140mm 5.5-inch gun and several 25mm anti-aircraft guns, and for underwater attacks, she had 6 forward torpedo tubes with a reload capacity of 21 torpedoes. This blend of heavy armament, long range, and an aircraft-carrying design made I-8 an ambitious feat of engineering, a submarine meant to operate independently across the vast expanses of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Commissioned in late 1938, I-8 entered service as Japan expanded its submarine arm ahead of the Pacific War. She took part in early war patrols linked to the Pearl Harbor operation in December 1941, cruising north of Oahu to intercept any ships leaving the harbor, before shifting to the US West Coast in Japan's first probing patrols of American shores. In 1942, she operated in the South Pacific, including missions around Guadalcanal, where Japanese submarines primarily delivered supplies and opportunistically attacked Allied shipping. I-8's direct successes in this period were limited, but she remained part of Japan's undersea presence in contested waters. In 1943, she was selected for one of the most ambitious submarine missions of the war, a Yanagi voyage to occupied France to exchange technology and personnel with Germany. Under Captain Shinji Uchino, I-8 sailed from Japan in June, carrying diplomats, technicians, raw materials, and weapons. She crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and rendezvoused with German U-161 before arriving in Brest on August 31, 1943. Welcomed by the Kriegsmarine, her crew toured Europe while the boat received a German radar set. For the return voyage in October, she loaded an array of German military technology, industrial goods, and specialists, successfully completing the round trip in December after more than 30,000 miles at sea, the only Japanese submarine to complete such a mission both ways. Early in 1944, I-8 underwent refit in Japan, removing her aircraft hangar and adding fittings for Kaiten suicide torpedoes. On January 15th, Commander Tatsunosuke Arizumi took command. A seasoned submarine officer, Arizumi would soon lead I-8 on patrols that turned from ordinary commerce raiding into episodes of appalling brutality. Under Arizumi's command, I-8 gained lasting infamy for war crimes against shipwreck survivors. 2 incidents in 1944 stand out: the attacks on the Dutch merchant ship SS Tjisalak in March and the American Liberty ship SS Jean Nicolet in July. In each case, I-8 torpedoed the vessel and then oversaw the systematic massacre of the survivors. These atrocities were conducted in cold blood and in violation of the laws of war, leaving only a handful of witnesses to tell the tale. On March 26, 1944, I-8 was on patrol in the Indian Ocean, south of Ceylon, Sri Lanka, when it spotted the 5,787-ton Dutch freighter SS Tjisalak, carrying a cargo of flour from Melbourne to Colombo, was unescorted and making 10 knots. At about 5:45 that morning, lookouts on the freighter saw the telltale wake of incoming torpedoes. The Tjisalak's captain tried to evade, but 2 torpedoes struck the ship in quick succession. The blasts stopped the ship's engine and sent her into a doomed circle with a jammed rudder. As water flooded the holds, the crew transmitted a distress call and began to abandon ship in 3 lifeboats. I-8 surfaced about 1,000 yards off the stricken freighter's quarter. Remarkably, the Tjisalak's defenders fought back. A gunner manned the ship's Oerlikon 20mm cannon as the submarine broached the surface. The merchant ship's 4-inch deck gun also got into action, firing several shells toward the submarine and compelling I-8 to crash dive twice. Only when the circling freighter's guns could no longer bear did I-8 surface for good. By 6 a.m., Tjisalak rolled onto her side and sank stern first, leaving her survivors adrift about 500 miles south of Colombo. About 97 to 105 people had been on board Tjisalak, and nearly all 100-plus crew and passengers survived the sinking and clustered in the lifeboats. Their relief would be short-lived. I-8 now closed in on the lifeboats. Through a loud hailer, a Japanese officer speaking English ordered the Tjisalak's captain to come forward, or everyone would be shot. With guns trained on them, the survivors had no choice but to obey and row toward the submarine. Upon reaching I-8, the Tjisalak's captain and 6 others, including 3 of his officers and an American Red Cross nurse who had been a passenger, were taken inside the submarine, below decks. The remaining dozens of survivors were forced to clamber onto I-8's deck at gunpoint. What followed was systematic slaughter. The I-8 crew robbed the captives of any valuables and forced them to sit squatting on the deck with their hands tied, surrounded by men with submachine guns, rifles, and swords. Working in pairs, the Japanese sailors began to execute the prisoners. They tied the survivors together 2 by 2, then dragged each pair aft of the conning tower. There, an execution party fell upon them with samurai swords, monkey wrenches, and sledgehammers, hacking and bludgeoning the defenseless men. After this torture, the victims were finished off with gunshots and kicked overboard into the sea. At times, one man in a pair was forced to watch his comrade's murder before being killed in turn. Those who panicked and jumped into the water were calmly shot while swimming. Eyewitness testimony later recounted that some of I-8's crew treated the massacre as grotesque sport, sitting in deck chairs and laughing while they used rifles to pick off survivors in the water. During this carnage, Tjisalak's captured captain was briefly interrogated on the submarine's bridge, then summarily killed with a sword. The other officers taken below were also killed, and the lone American female nurse was brought back on deck and shot to death that same evening. By the time I-8 sailed away, the vast majority of Tjisalak's survivors were dead, machine-gunned, beaten, or drowned. Incredibly, a few men managed to survive by feigning death or escaping in the confusion. Either 5 or 6 men in total survived the massacre. These few drifted for days on wreckage until they were finally rescued by another Allied ship, the American Liberty ship SS James O. Wilder. The survivors' testimonies, given after the war, would provide detailed evidence of I-8's atrocities on that day. The Tjisalak massacre stands as a stark example of wartime brutality at sea, nearly an entire complement of shipwreck survivors butchered after a sinking. It is worth noting that Tjisalak was not the only victim of I-8's first patrol under Ariazumi. The total loss of life in I-8 sinkings during this patrol, aside from those rescued, raised suspicions. Allied intelligence noted that hardly any survivors remained from ships I-8 attacked, suggesting that other unrecorded atrocities might have occurred beyond the Tjisalak incident. I-8 returned to base in May 1944 and soon headed out on another patrol in June. this time targeting Allied shipping off the Maldives and towards the coast of East Africa. After sinking a British ship, SS Nellore, and taking some of its survivors on board in late June, I-8 set the stage for a second notorious atrocity. On the night of July 2, 1944, I-8 encountered the SS Jean Nicolet, a United States Liberty ship, in the Indian Ocean, roughly 700 miles south of Ceylon. The Jean Nicolet, like Tjisalak, was sailing alone. She was a 7,176-ton cargo ship bound from Australia to India, carrying war supplies and about 100 souls aboard, including merchant marine crew, US Navy armed guards, and Army passengers. 2 torpedoes from I-8 slammed into Jean Nicolet. The explosions set the ship ablaze, and she quickly lost power. The captain of Jean Nicolet sent a distress signal and ordered the ship abandoned. All 4 lifeboats and several rafts were launched safely. About 90 to 99 men made it off the sinking ship alive. As darkness fell, the Jean Nicolet drifted burning, and I-8 surfaced nearby with a bright searchlight cutting across the waves. What happened next closely, and tragically, paralleled the Tjisalak affair. Spotting one lifeboat, I-8 trained its machine guns on the occupants and ordered them to come alongside. Under threats, the Japanese crew forced the first group of survivors to clamber onto the submarine's deck. Almost immediately, an I-8 crewman singled out the ship's cabin boy, a teenager on his first voyage, and shot him in the head with a pistol, kicking his body overboard. This sudden execution was a grim signal of what was to come. The now empty lifeboat was riddled with gunfire and sunk as a warning to the other survivors. Moving methodically, I-8 sailors rounded up the Jean Nicolet survivors from each lifeboat and raft. They fired on or chased down anyone who tried to slip away in the dark. One group of 5 men managed to hide on a drifting raft and avoided capture, the only ones not taken prisoner that night. Everyone else, the majority of the crew and passengers, was brought aboard the submarine at gunpoint. As on Tjisalak, the captives were stripped of life jackets, shoes, and any valuables. The Japanese tied the prisoners' hands using ropes or wire and forced them to sit on the foredeck, heads down on their knees. Any man who raised his head or made a sound was beaten with iron pipes or slashed with bayonets. At midnight, with Jean Nicolet still burning in the distance, Commander Arizumi himself came on deck. Arizumi, or his officers, then delivered a harangue to the remaining prisoners, boasting of Japan's coming victory and mocking the Americans as weak. According to witnesses, the I-8 commander shouted, "Americans are fools to fight Japan. Don't you know the Imperial Navy has sunk your entire fleet?" A false taunt reflecting Japanese propaganda. The ordeal worsened as the prisoners were forced to partake in a deadly gauntlet. One by one, in the small hours of July 3rd, groups of bound men were made to stumble aft along the deck of I-8, passing between 2 lines of Japanese crew armed with clubs, steel pipes, bayonets, and knives. In this gauntlet of death, the captives were beaten and stabbed repeatedly as they were dragged toward the stern. At the end of the line, survivors recalled a huge Japanese sailor waiting with a fixed bayonet. Any man still showing signs of life was impaled and then heaved overboard into the sea. The screams of men being slaughtered echoed in the darkness, while those still on the foredeck could only imagine the fate that awaited them. In an act of desperate courage, a few prisoners threw themselves overboard midway through the gauntlet, preferring to risk drowning while bound than certain execution. A couple of these men did survive, despite having their hands tied, by managing to stay afloat until rescue. By now, Jean Nicolet had taken hours of punishment. Many men had been killed, and many more were still awaiting their turn. Roughly 30 captives remained alive on I-8's deck as the massacre progressed. Then fate intervened. An incoming aircraft, an Allied patrol plane homing in, likely alerted by Jean Nicolet's SOS. With no time to untie prisoners or clear the deck, the submarine's officers suddenly ordered an emergency crash dive. In an instant, I-8 dived under the waves, casting the remaining bound prisoners into the ocean to drown as the sub went under. Moments later, a Royal Canadian Air Force Catalina flying boat roared overhead, illuminating a horrific scene of scattered bodies and struggling survivors. When the sun rose on July 3, 1944, the Jean Nicolet finally sank beneath the waves, and I-8 had escaped the area. Miraculously, in the following day and a half, a number of survivors endured the elements until help arrived. On July 4th, after some 30 hours adrift, the British escort trawler HMS Hoxha found and rescued 23 survivors from the water. Some sources say only 4 men survived, but official accounts put the number in the 20s. These men, a mix of Navy, Merchant Marine, and Army personnel, were the only witnesses left to recount the Jean Nicolet atrocity. The death toll was staggering. About 77 out of 100 men from Jean Nicolet perished between the sinking and the massacre. Amid the horror, one curious footnote emerged. It was later reported that I-8 had taken a small number of prisoners back to Japan from the Jean Nicolet incident, perhaps up to 5 men. The Jean Nicolet atrocity stands alongside the Tjisalak massacre as a testament to the extreme cruelty inflicted by I-8's crew in 1944. I-8's reign of terror in the Indian Ocean effectively ended after the Jean Nicolet incident. The submarine returned to base in August 1944. Commander Ariizumi relinquished command in November 1944 for a new assignment, and I-8 was refitted once more for Caton's suicide torpedoes, although she never actually carried them in combat. In early 1945, I-8 joined the defense of Okinawa. By then, Allied anti-submarine forces were overwhelming. On March 31, 1945, while south of Okinawa, I-8 was detected on the surface by the US destroyer USS Stockton. The destroyer and accompanying ships attacked with depth charges and hedgehog bombs, and I-8 was sunk with almost all hands. Of her crew, only one petty officer survived to be picked up by the Americans, making I-8's last battle as one-sided as her earlier atrocities. News of the Tjisalak and Jean Nicolet massacres only fully reached Allied authorities after these survivors were debriefed. At the war's end, in August 1945, Japanese naval officers involved in such crimes became targets for war crimes prosecution. Captain Tatsunosuke Ariizumi, however, never faced trial. After commanding the giant submarine I-401 late in the war, Ariizumi chose suicide over surrender. On August 30, 1945, as I-401 was en route to Japan to capitulate, Ariizumi shot himself in the sub's control room and his body was slipped into the sea. By taking his own life, he avoided any Allied court, much as some other notorious war criminals did at war's end. Most of I-8's crew did not survive the war either. Many were likely lost when the submarine was sunk in 1945. However, a few were found and brought to justice. Allied investigators managed to locate at least 3 former I-8 sailors implicated in the atrocities. One was discovered hiding in the United States after the war. He was offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying against his comrades. The other 2 were tried by military tribunals. They were convicted of war crimes for their roles in the murders of shipwreck survivors. These men received prison sentences. One source indicates around 8 years of hard labor in at least one case. In the early 1950s, with shifting post-war politics, the Japanese government commuted the remaining sentences of these convicted war criminals. They were released by 1955. Such clemency was not unusual, as many lower-ranking Axis war criminals were released or pardoned within a decade of the war's end. Nevertheless, the crimes of I-8's crew remained on the record as among the most egregious committed by Japanese naval forces. The story of submarine I-8 is a chilling chapter in naval history. At first, I-8 was notable for her unique design and for achieving the unprecedented voyage to Europe and back. But it is her dark legacy of atrocity that history most remembers. The massacres of the Tjisalak and Jean Nicolet survivors stand out as infamous events even amid the brutality of the Second World War. Few other submarine commanders, Axis or Allied, sank to the level of machine gunning and bayoneting defenseless castaways. The name I-8 thus became synonymous with an outlaw brand of warfare. For decades, these incidents were not widely known to the general public, overshadowed by larger horrors of the war. Many post-war histories of the Pacific War focused on major battles and strategic outcomes, and the crimes of a single submarine crew remained a footnote. Survivors, like those of Jean Nicolet and Tjisalak, however, ensured that the truth was recorded. Their eyewitness accounts were preserved in naval archives and war crimes trial documents, and occasionally shared in veteran newsletters and publications. It wasn't until much later that writers and historians brought these events back to light for wider audiences. The atrocity at sea inflicted by I-8's crew was condemned in its time and remains condemned by history. While the submarine itself lies somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific, the memory of its crimes has not entirely sunk beneath the waves. The names Tjisalak and Jean Nicolet live on in historical records as a testament to the victims and a warning of the depths to which warfare can descend when humanity is cast aside.